This is the Guatemalan Civil War by Ben Edwards, Sonny Corey, Daniel Brunt, and Jude Summer. Alright, so Cold War in context. The Cold War lasted from 1945 to 1991, and it was a global struggle between two nations, the Soviet Union and the United States. Instead of these nations fighting directly, they used proxy wars, which meant they supported opposing sides in conflicts around the world to spread their influence and try to gain support from other countries. The US wanted to stop the spread of communism and protect capitalism, while the Soviet Union wanted to do the opposite and support socialist movements. Latin America became important for the US because it was close to Washington, D.C., and the US was afraid if communistic ideology was to influence Latin America, that it would put the US security in jeopardy. This led to the reason US was involved with places like Guatemala, which was one of the earliest Cold War battlegrounds. Guatemala before the war. So before the Guatemalan Civil War, they had a democratic president named Jacob Arbenz, who came to power in 1950. He tried to help poor farmers by redistributing unused land owned by large companies like United Fruit. This made this company mad, and they turned to the US saying that Arbenz was turning his country into a communist country. This led to the US fearing Soviet influences spreading throughout Latin America, which then led to the US organizing Operation PB Success in 1954. This was a secret mission that overthrew Arbenz and replaced him with a military leader whose interests favored the US. This created massive political instability and crushed democratic freedoms. This led to violent civil war in 1960 between the government and leftist rebels. Now, what actually led to the outbreak of the Civil War? Well, the Guatemalan Civil War officially began in 1960 when a group of young military officers rose up against the US-backed dictatorship that had ruled since the 1954 coup. These officers were frustrated from corruption and the government's dependence from the US. Many were inspired from the success of the Cuban Revolution in 1959, which showed an armed regime could challenge foreign-backed regimes. The rebels began forming guerrilla groups which gained support from the poor and indigenous communities who faced poverty and land inequality.
During the Guatemalan Civil War, the United States acted as a dominant hidden hand, influencing the conflict from behind the scenes, framing its actions as part of the global mission to contain communism. The U.S. provided steady support to a series of Guatemalan military governments. This support included not only financial aid and shipments of weapons, but also the training of Guatemalan soldiers in the counterinsurgency tactics. The CIA and U.S. military advisors were directly involved in helping design and guide strategies used to suppress leftist rebel movements that the U.S. feared were inspired by Marxist ideologies. Meanwhile, on the opposing side, Cuba, aligned with the Soviet Union, played a much smaller but symbolically important role. Cuba offered limited training and propaganda support to the rebel groups, helping them spread revolutionary ideas among the poor and indigenous populations, particularly in rural regions. The Soviet Union itself had only minimal direct involvement, focusing on instead of focusing on itself instead of promoting ideological support rather than providing weapons or troops. Because of these dynamics, the Guatemalan Civil War became a smaller, yet significant, piece of the global East-West struggle between the United States and the USSR. The U.S. viewed Guatemala as a testing ground for the Cold War strategy in Latin America, using its influence to maintain a pro Western government and prevent a communist presence in the region. While the conflict was rooted in Guatemala's own social and ethnic divisions, foreign intervention amplified the violence and polarization. Ultimately, the war reflected how even local struggles for justice and equality became entangled in the larger geopolitical contest between superpowers.
Guatemala is a mountainous, hilly, and dense jungle country. It is in Central America and borders Mexico, Belize, and is bordered by Mexico, Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Sierra Madre Mountains run through the country, and much of the indigenous Maya population lives in the highlands. They were hit hard in the war. Guerrilla troops ran for cover in Pitens Mountains and forests to drop fast, and the government bombarded the villages where they thought the guerrillas were. Nature was part of the war, playing an important role in affecting the encounter and the lands. The Civil War was a conflict between the military-dominated state and the left-wing guerrilla allies of the Guatemalan National Revolutionary Unity, or URNG. The military ruled the nation under the dictatorial governments. The worst era in Guatemalan history is the regime of President General Efrain Rios Montt from 1982 to 83, where the Mayan genocide and the destruction of their culture took place through scorched earth tactics, as attested in the Commission of the United Nations report. The URNG, through its armed struggle, sought to rectify social injustices and promote indigenous peoples' rights. There were many indigenous leaders opposed to it, but they were heavily repressed, and the ordinary civilians were in the middle of the war. The Guatemalan Civil War tore the country's indigenous people apart. The villagers were being blamed by the military for helping the guerrilla combatants and therefore killing and excelling them. Dozens of villages were wiped off the earth's surface, and hundreds, if not thousands, of people were murdered, and many more disappeared. The deaths have caused extreme social rebellions, hunger, and tortures that have never ceased to exist in their country. And even though the peace accords were signed in 1996, survivors still carry the trauma of the past with them.
Thank you, Jude, for that input there. Now, onto the short-term effects. In the years immediately after U.S. intervention, Guatemala experienced political instability. For example, in 1954, the CIA-backed coup overthrew President Jacobo Arbenz, installing a military-led government under new President Carlos Castillo Armas. This regime intensified the human rights abuses. They targeted suspected leftist supporters. They created large-scale displacement where thousands fled to Mexico and the U.S. to escape the violence. Schools and local media were censored to promote anti-communist ideals, and civilians lived in constant fear. Now here's the video of the Carlos Castillo Armas assassination, showing the political unrest in Guatemala during this time.
The President of Guatemala, Carlos Castillo Armas, 42, has died at the presidential palace from an assassin's bullet. A foe of communism and a champion of democracy, his death came as violently as his rise to power. In 1954, anti-communist rebels rose to oust Guatemala's red-infiltrated government. Under the leadership of Colonel Castillo, the guerrillas won out over the regular army. Colonel Castillo returned triumphantly to the capital. A grateful people elected him president. A bullet has ended his career, but the freedom he established lives on.
Now onto the long-term consequences. The long-term consequences of U.S. intervention lasted decades. Even after the 1996 peace accords ended the Civil War, rural areas remained impoverished from the campaigns and violence. Weak democratic institutions meant the country struggled to hold officials accountable, often resulting in corruption. While social divisions persisted between communities that had supported the military and those affected by the massacres. Trials against figures like Efrain Rios Montt, who was convicted of genocide decades after the atrocities he committed, were often delayed or overturned. Corruption, gang violence, and ineffective government control continued to challenge Guatemala even after the Civil War was over. Now into some modern term connections. The consequences of the U.S. intervention are still visible today. Families displaced during the 1980s settled in Mexico or the U.S., contributing to modern migration crisis. Guatemala continues to pursue justice through institutions like the Historical Clarification Commission. Through trials against military leaders were slow and incomplete. This piece of history also shows how superpower involvement can destabilize smaller countries, a pattern which we have seen in Central America and the world. We see it today in the Syrian Civil War, which happened, where the U.S., Russia, and Iran backed different sides, creating conflict. The Guatemalan Civil War shows how a powerful country can leave deep scars on a smaller nation.